So you see that you guys are very young, okay? As maybe you will find some of the things that I will explain a bit complex, which is perfectly fine. Okay, so I'll made a presentation assuming that you are like a young, intelligent adults, and I hope it will be fine. If you don't understand everything, it's perfectly normal. This seminar called Real World Risk Institute is given by these three very smart men who are called Rafael Douadi, who is the guy in the left, Robert Fry, who is the guy in the center, who worked for Renaissance Technologies. Rafael in the left is a mathematician, and in the right of your screen you have Nassim. It's Nassim Taleb. He's a writer and a former trader, and he's very famous because he has written many books. So before attending that seminar, I read Nassim's books, and well, Nassim is a very smart fellow, and my friend Stefan Gasic, who did this drawing that I'm showing you here, calls these three guys the Ghostbusters. And later I will explain you why the Ghostbusters. So not ghost, huh? Ghostbusters. Stefan helps me with this page where I put some of the insights that I got in Real World Risk Institute called Antifragilist, and me and some other guys, even some of the guys in this picture have done posts in my webpage. But let me start before I explain you things that I learned in that week of February in New York City. Some story, okay, that is a nice story in my as per my assessment. Okay, so this gentleman in the left is called Fry Richardson, and he was a Quaker, British man. Okay, he lived in the 20th century, and he was drafted for World War II, and he was a pacifist, and he didn't want to go to war. So he was not allowed to be a college teacher and a researcher as he wanted. So he became like a self-taught mathematician. Okay? And he thought that war was like the main problem that humanity had and that he wanted to help resolving. And he had this theory by which wars would depend on the length of the border between countries. Okay, so he started collecting data to see if his theory was any good as a good scientist, and he started by the border between my country, Spain, and Portugal in Europe. Okay, so this is in the westernmost south tip of Europe. And he noticed something very strange. When he was looking into the books, he saw that some books were saying that this border was like 1,250 kilometers, and some other books were saying that this border was 950 kilometers. And that was not like a normal kind of discrepancy. Okay, so his conclusions might alter if he would take one data point or the other, because it's like a 30% difference. This is like, you would assume as normal, I don't know, 1% difference, but 30%, there was something strange there. And then he said, like, I will try to measure myself. Okay, and he started to try to take measures of this object that is the border between the Spain and Portugal. And he noticed that if he used a very long ruler like this one, okay, then he would obtain like a shorter distance than if he used a very short ruler. Okay, so you see that this long ruler, it would not going to the rugged areas, right? So I think that even if you don't understand the math behind, you can understand that if I get a very, very small ruler, and this area where I put the ruler is like some mountains and below is like some river, well, these windy areas where the river would go, if I take a 10-kilometer ruler, I will not get a distance that is shorter than 10 kilometers. But if I get a ruler that is like 10 centimeters, then I can get into all these tiny areas, you know, that are so convoluted and so rugged and so forth. Okay, and then so the main point is that if he used the ruler A, he would get like a shorter distance than ruler B, and assume that ruler B is like half of ruler A. Then it was like he found out what it is called power laws. Okay, so if we say like this is half, okay, then why power laws? Okay, well, power laws because you will have the description of the slope of that describes the length of this border will depend on uh, power, or let's say a base to the power of minus k, that would be the exponent. Okay, and well, that's the description of how this mathematical object that is the border would work. And in his discovery, that would go this way. Okay, if he reduced the ruler by half, the border between Spain and Portugal would get like 18% longer. And this 0.18 is the exponent of this power law that I'm putting you here. Okay, so that's the what would be the result if this exponent was 1? Okay, and there was a very smart mathematician that was called Benoit Mandelbrot, that is Nassim, this writer I was telling you, this one of the guys who gives this seminar, hero, that asked himself that question. He wrote what Louis Fry Richardson had written, and he came to the conclusion that a coastline or a border that would be so rugged, you know, that the exponent would be 1, it would be that you would reduce the ruler by half and you will get 2 times the value. That's almost like an asymptotic thing. That would mean that that object would be so rugged that would more or less close in itself, and it would no longer be a line. That object would almost be like covering a whole plane, and that would be almost a 2-dimensional object. And after this observation, he wrote a paper that it is a very influential academic paper that was called "How Long is the Coastline of Britain?" Okay, so this went into the Nature magazine and made him like a famous gentleman, and he would explain that he would basically add 1 to the exponent that I was telling you and define this Hausdorff dimension that is also known as fractal dimension, that in the case of a very smooth coastline, let's say South Africa, that would only be slightly superior to 1. So this is South Africa coast, their left, this is a southern tip of Africa. It's almost a line. Okay, so this is almost dimension 1. But see Norway, that it's this very rugged coastline in the north of Europe, where you have these fjords that are produced by the ice, and this is very rugged coastline. And if you reduce your ruler when you are measuring that coastline by half, you will get almost half more of the distance. So this fractal dimension of the Norway coast is 1.52. So you get almost an object that is not a line anymore. Okay, it's almost a two-dimensional object. So if you know this, like a line is one dimension, a square will be like 2 dimension. Okay, so this coastline of Norway is somewhere in the middle between a line and a two-dimensional object. Okay, and if you see this in the left is what I was explaining you before. We are reducing the ruler when we measure the coastline of Britain, that it's a bit more rugged than the border between Spain and Portugal that I was telling you before, and has this dimension 1.25. Okay, and then as we reduce by half the ruler, we will obtain values that are 25% longer than the previous value. Okay, so we can iterate many times and obtain longer and longer values. So it's in a way, these coastlines are almost infinite and depend on the scaling of your ruler. But the thing is, the beautiful thing is that Mandelbrot constructed a whole theory. Okay, this started. This is not very old, which is almost amazing. Okay, because these fractals, okay, there's objects that are not lines nor two-dimensional objects, are everywhere. Okay, and nature likes fractals. Okay, so what I'm putting you here is a coastline that was the example that Mandelbrot was given. This theory is from the 70s of the 20th century, so it's not so old. You can say how can be that humanity we have gone for so long without knowing about these objects. And you see these objects have this property that if you look them very close or if you look in them very far away, they look almost the same. Okay, they have what we call self-similarity. This applies also to broccoli, that I'm sure that you guys like broccoli, don't you? You seem to have it. You do, huh? Well, it's very healthy, and it's also self-similar. If you look it very close, you know, to this structure of broccoli, it will look with the same shape that if you look it from very far away. Okay, this is the shapes that repeat itself. This is what we call self-similarity. Your body, so you guys are objects of a fractal dimension. Okay, you may not know this, but the capillaries that connect your veins and your arteries to your lungs are fractal objects, and they divide into many little veins to connect to your lungs. And if you would put those capillaries in a straight line going to the moon, okay, you could, by only the length of your veins and your capillaries, get to the moon and come back. It's like in a small kid like yourselves, it's almost impossible, which means that we humans, we almost have like an additional dimension. This applies to other animals as well. Is this fractal dimension. It's like we are more like four dimensional objects. So these power laws explain many things. Okay, so they explain things very interesting as, for instance, if you have this gorgeous lady on the right and a dog, and the woman is 120 pounds and the dog is 60 pounds, it would explain how the metabolic rate of the woman versus the dog scales. Okay, so there are some economies of scales. What does this mean? Okay, so the exponent of this power law depends a bit on what I was saying. You see, your volume scales in 3 dimensions, but you have like an additional dimension that is your fractal dimension. Okay, and this power law scales like with an exponent of 3/4, which means that, you know, if a dog, for instance, needs 880 calories a day, what do you think, that the woman that it is 2 times as heavy as the dog needs 2 times as many calories to function? No, it's not exactly 2 times. There is some economy of a scale, okay? And she will need something that it will be more like 3/4 of what the dog needs in extra to function, okay? So if the dog needs 800 calories, like 3/4 would be like some more 500 calories of what the dog is eating. So she would not need like to eat 2 times as this German Shepherd. She would need like something like 1,300 calories to keep her metabolic rate. And what I'm saying like calories, I could tell you like heartbeats. Okay, so um, the heartbeats of the lady will not be like 2 times as slow, or the dogs will not be like 2 times faster than the lady, even if he's half the size. It will be more like something like 3/4. Okay, and these power laws and these scaling laws, there are in many interesting things. So if you think, I don't know, what is the number of petrol stations in your city, it scales in a very similar manner. It will be more like 85%, 0.85, the exponent of that power law, but you will have less petrol stations in bigger cities in relative terms than in very small cities. So there are like economies of scale some. And this is very, very interesting properties. And guys, it's also, these things that I'm explaining you are a bit the fundament of a new science. And there was a very smart guy who wrote this book called A New Kind of Science. It's a physicist called Stefan Wolfram. And in 2002, he wrote a book in which he explained laws of cellular automata, and he gives like all the rules that are possible to generate objects like this Sierpinski triangle. Sierpinski was like the mathematician that defined this object the first. And the rules that you have in the left that tell you like what is the value that if my cells can have in this square sort of crosswords reticula can have a black and white value, depending on what are the values of the neighboring cells, according to this rule 90, which will be the value of if I iterate this rule many times, that I will be obtaining in the neighboring cells. And this thing about the cellular automata is the point about this is two of them. Is, well, that we can automate with a programming the generation of these fractal objects that are in a way infinite, as this triangle, if you see in the left, after so many iterations, how it's behaving. And that with very simple rules, you can achieve very complex objects. Okay, so in a way, like your DNA will have encoded instructions to build your capillars that are a bit similar to the generation of this Sierpinski triangle. Okay, and even more, this gentleman Stephen Wolfram, he speculates that our whole universe responds to a simple rule, not necessarily a cellular automata one, but a simple rule that iterated many, many times. It generates very simple, very complex shapes from very simple rules. And this insight, okay, is what we call the fundamentals of complexity science. That when they asked another very famous scientist, that was Stephen Hawking, Mr. Hawking, what would you think that the 21st century will be? The science of biology? If the 20th century was the science of physics, what will be the 21st century? And he said, I think that the 21st century is going to be the century of complexity science. Okay, so he was one of the smartest guys alive, guys. Now, I was explaining you about this self-similarity, okay? If I see close into the things or if I see far from the things, I will get like the same shapes, for instance, when I see borders, coastlines, but this is also in finance, okay? And most of the guys that go to this seminar that I was telling you, a real world risk, are interested in finance. So if I see these two shapes of the value of Google stock in time, and I'm not giving you this scale, I hide these scales, you cannot say which one is the shape that corresponds to a 6 month kind of variation and which one is the one of the 6-day kind of variation. Okay, so you need the ruler for these things. So these power laws that I'm explaining you, these things like self-similarity, it's not just something theoretical that I'm telling you. It applies to many things. It applies even to finance. Okay, and there are some of the guys that I'm telling you that by using some of these insights have made a lot of money. Okay, now when I'm talking you about self-similarity also, wealth of people is distributed with one of these power laws. Okay, so Nassim, when he explained about these power laws, sometimes he says like a best way to understand them is say when you double, you double. Okay, this is a bit complex to define, okay, but and actually the discovery of power laws, it was not Fry Richardson. Fry Richardson was more into the fractal thing. The power laws, the first one who discovered them was this gentleman called Pareto when he was studying the distribution of wealth in Italy. And he realized that, that wealth was very unevenly distributed. And I'm not going to judge here if that's okay or not okay. It's just how the world is, okay? And it's with a small variation among countries, you generally find that there is this rule that he called like the 80-20 rule, in which 80% of the wealth is owned by 20% of the landlords, okay? And since there is self-similarity, this means that even among those 20% that have 80% of the wealth, also the top 20% will own most of the wealth, which means that this rule could also be called the 4/64 rule, meaning that the 4% that have more wealth would have like 64% of the wealth. And you keep iterating, you have like 1% of the people own 50% of the wealth. Okay, so it's the same if you say 80-20 or if you say 4/64 or 1/50. It's more or less the same because it's always like the same pattern that repeats itself many times. And if I say like, if you know the properties of these, of the scaling of this power law, and you know that there are 200,000 people that have more than say $10 million, okay? I can more or less know how many guys, that maybe something like 2,000 guys will have more than $1 billion. And if I want to know how many guys will have like $100 billion like Jeff Bezos, this is just, seeing how this scales, I can more or less determine that there will be 1 or 2 guys that will have like more than $100 billion, okay? And if we increase the population, I would expect that the number of guys that will have more than $100 billion goes from 1 or 2 to more people, okay? So this is how it goes. And so I know this is a bit technical, but you don't need to fully understand it. What I would like to you is that one day, okay, you will study statistics. And I don't know if when you will study statistics, when I was in college, I was not studying these statistics that I'm presenting you here, and I find it like very sad, okay? Because the most interesting statistics is the one that corresponds to this power law that I'm explaining you here. But the statistics that they teach normally in college or in high school are more like the ones below, that there's a more like Gaussian. And remember that I told you that these guys, Raphael, Nassim, and Robert were the Ghostbusters. Well, they call themselves the Ghostbusters, okay, because they say that the more important insights that you will be getting are in what they call, in what Nassim called, extremistan. Okay, so you need to make the difference, okay, between the statistical properties of the shape in the left, in the top of your left, and the shape that it is below that. So the shape that it's on the top left, that would describe, for instance, wealth distribution, is you say like it's what Nassim called fat tail distributed. Okay, so this, why fat tail? Okay, I'm going to explain you why he calls this fat tail. It's fat tail because, I mean, if you think of this shape of the percent of people on the top, that the wealth distribution in the United States or in Canada or something, okay, you will have, I don't know, that most people have something like $50,000, something like that. Maybe that's 10% of the people. That's the most common value. And if you look how many will have $100,000, well, you will have like maybe 5%, half that value. Okay. If you see how many will have $200,000, well, that will be maybe something like 2%. Not many people are wealthy, but some. And you can see like this is a very fat and long tailed in that even for extreme values, and I'm saying like the normal person has $50,000, but there are still people that have $250,000, and there will be people like Jeff Bezos that have 10 or $100 billion. It's not like they don't exist. So this is fat tail because even it decreases slowly. Okay, you can say that potentially there is no upper limit. Okay, and it's also like if you think a bit more about that, the mean is a bit irrelevant in these domains. Okay, so this is what Nassim called extremistan, and he also called it fat tail because Nassim comes from Lebanon, that is a country in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, and they eat something called liye. There's like the tail of a lamb, okay? And it's like very fat, very fatty and wide. And when he saw this shape of this distribution of, like, for instance, wealth, and that in details of the distribution you still had a lot of values, it reminded him of this liye that they eat in Lebanon. That's why we call why he called it fat tail distribution. Now you have a normal distribution, and this is what you guys will see in high school, I guess, or maybe in college. I don't know how will it mean. This is, for instance, the value, the distribution of the values of height and weight. Okay, and now I was telling you, you can have a gentleman, and this is like extremist and stress test, that has $100 billion. But guys, can we have like, can there be a gentleman that has like, that it is 64-kilometer tall? Is that possible? That would be impossible. Not even Godzilla is 64 kilometer tall, right? And Godzilla does not even exist. So this means that that tail of the distribution is not that wide. Okay, so you may have like a gentleman that is 5 foot tall. The average gentleman will be like 6 foot tall, and you may have even a gentleman is 7 foot tall. Okay, but if you go 7 foot and it's like it's called the beyond the mean, you have the standard deviation, and you got 2 or 3 standard deviations, there will be very few people there. Okay, and maybe there are less than 2% of people that are 5 feet tall or smaller. Okay, and if I want to find a man that is 1 foot tall, he will not exist. Okay, so that's like if you can say like where I'm in extremistan, where I'm in mediocristan, that for Nassim are like completely separate domains, and you need to understand. Okay, this is one of the main things that you would get if one day you go to this Real World Risk Institute or you read the Nassim books as much as I have, is that extremistan and mediocristan, so the objects that have mathematical properties that are driven by the mean are in mediocristan, are the ones where this mean is irrelevant and where the extreme events are the ones that carry the more value, are in extremistan, are different animals. You cannot compare the one with the other. So Nassim wrote a very famous book. Okay, this was called The Black Swan. Okay, and this Black Swan is a metaphor he found that says about these things that are in extremistan, in which, okay, and there is the rare event is the one that has the more importance. Okay, so Nassim has written with an Italian mathematician called Dr. Cirillo recently an article that has gone also into Nature magazine that shows that, for instance, infectious diseases like coronavirus are fat tail distributed. Okay, so it's I don't care that much if most of the seasonal flus are killing not many people, uh, because that would be like more the normal event, because from time to time there is something extraordinary like a coronavirus that can have like a lot of casualties. Okay, and if we go deeper into the past, okay, so now coronavirus may have killed 1 million people, and your seasonal flu might only kill 1/10 of those numbers. Okay, hopefully it will not get much worse, but if we study the past, okay, you have something like the Black Death that killed 140 million Europeans. Can you imagine that over the 14th century? So that shaped the world. Okay, these rare events. So most swans are white, but some swans are black. And what Nassim is saying is that those rare black swans, when you are in mediocristan, things like Black Death, or if we talk about wars, things like World War II, wars are also objects that are from extreme and long tail distributed. If you see the number of victims of wars, the bigger wars are the ones that will explain most of the history. Okay, even if most wars would be like, I don't know, two Italian cities fighting each other in the 14th century, and there will be like 10 or 100 people there in every city, and we have mostly forgotten about it. Okay, so there will be more such wars, small skirmish, but it's something like World War II that determines the properties, the statistical properties of wars. So this is something that it's also, say, like Nassim also always insists on these things, that absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. Okay, so if I was surveying wars and in my sample there was no World War II and only I had um, a small skirmish between Italian towns in the 14th century, I might conclude that war is not is not something we should worry about. Okay, or if I do the same with virus and I say like, the virus they are not very scary because I had the flu last year. Well, that's not good thinking. Okay, because these infectious diseases have tail risks that are very serious. Okay, and we never know, especially with new diseases, how bad it can be. Okay, which means that when you don't know, and you are in this extremistan kind of domains, you have to be very careful. Things like if you don't know, you just be careful, okay? You just assume that it could be something as bad as Black Death. Hopefully, coronavirus seems it's not going to be as bad as Black Death, okay? So, but if you have opacity, if you have uncertainty, the best course of action is just assume the worst case scenario. Now, more things that I learned in that week in New York, okay? Nassim calls it convexity and concavity. So it's a bit linked to what I was just explaining you, okay? So there are these rare events. Now, assume something like a meteorite falling from the sky. That was, I think you all guys know this, right? How these dinosaurs disappeared. It was a meteorite. That's the most common theory. Okay, so this meteorite would be like a very rare event. Okay, most meteorites are very small and they will just produce some light in the sky and it will not cause a lot of damage. But a very large meteorite can kill every single dinosaur in the world. Okay. Now, probably there were already mice when there were dinosaurs. Okay, and mice did not disappear. Okay, so now we have like 20 billion mice in the world. Only in the island of Manhattan, there are 8 million mice. Okay, whereas we have 400,000 elephants in the whole world. So Nassim says like, if there was a new meteorite like the one that killed the dinosaurs, it will probably kill the elephants because there are not that many, but it will probably not kill cockroaches or mice because there are so many, right? So it's like, if we study again the mathematical properties of this, it's like if you have X is your event and you are studying the function of X, what happens if X happens? Okay, the variable X can be something like a meteorite falling. If you have a very heavy event like a meteorite, well, mice would not be wiped out because they are convex. They are what Nassim calls anti-fragile. There is a horrible event and they are not wiped out. Whereas elephants will be wiped out. So if you study the evolution of this, of the properties of elephant survival as per this variable, like damage by a meteorite, the number of elephants will go down. Okay, but this is like a concave function, and this is fragile. So you say like, Nassim said, like elephants are more fragile to damage than mice are. It will also apply if an elephant jumps from distance that will be like, I don't know, half of his height, he will get more damage than if a mice jumps from a distance half of his height, you know. So it applies to several domains, and normally the smaller is more anti-fragile than the bigger. So again, these convex and concave mathematical functions is a bit difficult maybe for kids to understand, but I think you will understand very well if I show you this. Okay, convex is anti-fragile, and see that smile and happy face. Concave is fragile. So you want to be convex. One of the things that Nassim tells is like, you better be convex than right. Okay, so you don't need to know why being a mice means that you may survive better to an earthquake or to something like a meteorite. Okay, you just prefer to be convex than being concave. Okay, so this is one of the ideas from this book of 2012 that was called Anti-Fragile. Now I will keep talking about some of the ideas that are discussed there. Okay, so Nassim's most recent book in this series that he calls the Incerto is called Skin in the Game. And what does he understand by skin in the game? He explains this with an example of a gentleman that he calls Bob Rubin. Well, he's an actual gentleman that existed. And Bob Rubin was Secretary of the Treasury with Bill Clinton. And when he left politics, he became head of a bank, Citibank. Okay. And for many years, this gentleman was taking like risks that were not very visible because he was, so to say, mixing with the mathematical properties of the models he was using, and he was assuming that the risk he was taking with the leverage when he was giving credits or investing in complex products were like from mediocre 10, when in fact were from extremis 10, as I was telling you before. And this guy was like getting paid bonuses every year. Now in 2008, we had a very, very, very severe crisis. Some of you were almost not born, but your moms certainly remember this. And what happened? Okay, this guy was fired from being Citibank president, CEO, but all the bonuses that he had accrued over the years when he was taking crazy risks, he kept them, okay? And on top of that, the government said Citibank is too big to fail, okay? So we bail out Citibank, okay? So this is almost an ethical dilemma, because with your taxes or the taxes that your mom and your dad were paying, we were saving the bank from the mistakes of like this gentleman had done for over the many years when he had been being paid for taking crazy risks. And what Nassim says is that never before, if you look like the Roman generals, and this is like a picture of Julian, the Roman emperor, well, they made mistakes also, but they paid for their mistakes. So when Julian decided that he wanted to invade Persia and he thought that it was a good idea, he created an army, and he was like heading that army to invade Persia. Okay. Now, when we have had the wars recently in the Middle East, well, we're not like the guys who were deciding that those wars were going to be fought. We're not fighting those wars. Okay? Not many times, not even their children were fighting those wars. So this is like a very perverse system of affairs in which people don't have what Nassim calls a skin in the game, which is the title of his book. Okay. Well, I'll not go very much into detail because it's a bit complicated, but I'll introduce a last concept before I wrap up, and then you can ask me questions. There is a Ergodicity that it's also in this book, and even in his first book of this Incerto series, that it is very good. And ergodicity is another mathematical property, okay, that describes some systems, and it is used in thermodynamics and in some other areas. And Nassim uses it more into more philosophical stuff, okay? And then you have this comic strip done by my friend Stefan Gasic, in which you have like a doctor economist that said like, okay, my study proves that if flu shot is 100% fatal, okay, it's like, say, if you give, then this guy who is reading the study says, you gave 1,000 flu shots to one patient, and the other guy says, okay, it's like it was easier to give 1,000 shots to one patient than 1,000 shots to 1,000 patients. Okay, so I finished my study earlier. Okay, and it's not the same, right? It's not the same if you give 1,000 flu shots to one kid than if you give 1,000 one shot to 1,000 kids. Okay, so it's not the same. So
That
Nassim,
kid wouldn't like it.
well, if I
I
give
have
you
a
one,
question.
if yes, please, Will.
What happened if the kid died after 500?
Well, this doctor is so crazy that he keep giving shots to the dead kid, you know. But it's
Why would he give him 500 more shots once he's dead?
because he's an idiot. Okay, and it's like you have to be careful of people that think like that. Okay, and this is that the point is that there are some risks that you should not be taken, and you should know which which these risks are. Okay, and it's called ergodicity. Okay, it applies to when there are like what Nassim called absorbing barriers. Okay, so it's also you can apply one game that is non-ergodic that Nassim gives many times as an example is the Russian roulette. Okay, if you might not know what Russian roulette is, maybe you do, but Russian roulette is like you put one bullet in the barrel of a pistol that has 6 spaces, and you just give a roll to that, and then you shoot yourself. And you have 1/6 probability of getting a bullet and dying. Okay. Now the thing is that if you have 6 guys who play one time to this game, on average there will be 5 of them that will win. If they are betting, they will become richer. But if you guys play 6 times on a row to such game, you will be dead. Okay, because 6 times you are sure that you will be dead. So this is the kind of risks that you should never be taking. And it's what, when there is like an absorbing barrier, or if you have like there in the right area, there's this fish fillet where you get in, but you cannot get out. Okay. So in this real world risk institute, they give you some tricks. There's something like, for instance, if you go to the casino 6 fights on a row, you may probably not die, but you will probably got ruined, okay? So, because casinos are like very tricky. Now, if you apply to some games, like, I don't know, maybe blackjack, some techniques that are called like the Kelly criterion, and you size your bets appropriately, and you only bet with the money that you are earning, and you do the things very wisely, you may win the casino, okay? But it's very complicated. And anyway, you should also understand that risks are not all the same. It's not the same to go and fight a war for the sake of your country or the honor of your nation, or going to the casino, okay? Because it also depends on the scale to which you are defending. If you're defending your country, this is like a layer that is superior, that if you are just trying to earn some jackpot in a machine, in a money machine. Okay, so I think that I've covered 15 slides for more than 2 minutes each, more than half an hour. That was what I was asked to present you. This gentleman is Nassim, who he was a trader. So in the left you saw it as a trader. Then he became rich and he started doing deadlifts. And now he's a very strong and what he calls very anti-fragile. Huh? And when you will be a bit older, I would say like you should read his books, because they are very, very, very intelligent and very interesting. Okay, so if you have any more questions, I'm just ready to tell you to to answer your questions. No questions?
Thank you.
Okay, well guys, hope you like this presentation, and remember, you don't need to understand everything. Okay, just when you will go to high school or college and they will present you this normal distribution, just don't think that everything is like that. Okay, just take that idea. Okay, so statistics has a lot of layers. Okay, and it's not the same coronavirus as Black Death as the normal flu. Okay, and you should not compare normal flu with or you should not compare things like traffic accidents, okay, that are not contagious and don't have significant tail risks, with things like coronavirus, which are more tricky. You cannot have half of the humanity wiped out by traffic accidents, but something like Black Death can kill half of the population of Europe. Okay, and well, if you study a lot, you may end up distinguishing, which are the objects that have these properties and which are the objects that not. But if you just manage to understand things like, okay, it cannot be a man of 64 kilometers, but I can have a man that is 100 billion rich, you are already understanding a little bit the main ideas that are given in this seminar. Okay. So thank you, guys. I'll stop it here, and hope that you will look into these fascinating topics that I explained to you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.